Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we continue on with the 20s, and we're going to be looking at what makes the 20s the roaring 20s, but also how that only captures half of our story. So it's important to think about the 1920s in terms of opposing forces. And we can see competing value systems even in our modern world, whether we're talking about things like equality versus equity, liberty versus security. In the 1920s, we're going to see the following become an ever increasing dynamic that is separating Americans. So this idea of Anglo versus foreign, and by Anglo we mean white Protestant American. And certainly we saw this as we talked about things like the National Origins Act and really a closing to what had been the open immigration of an earlier era. Young versus old, we're going to have a youth culture for the first time. And that means that we can prolong adolescence, so children don't have to start work as early as they once did, but they're going to have their own culture, dress, music that marks them differently from people who are of older generations. By 1920, the census shows more people in the United States live in urban centers than in rural ones. And that phenomenon had been certainly a trend continuing since the 1840s, but it is quite a difference, and ultimately one that still plays out today when we look at politics voting patterns. Wet versus dry, the great issue to bring in the 1920s is the 18th Amendment. And we see that for those who are advocates of prohibition, they are dry. For those who believe that the government shouldn't be able to have that role in people's lives in terms of controlling what they drink, they are our wets. And then we're also going to see science versus fundamentalism. We're going to see that, especially in the rural small town, that is going to be communities that are often church going, fundamentalist in terms of their understanding of Protestant religiosity and practice. And that's going to come up against the technology and the secular understanding of education that is coming to be in the 1920s. So when we look at the 1920s as a new era, I mean, you can see from dress, women cutting their hair, women are going to wear makeup, and that's socially acceptable for the first time. Some of this is just simply a reaction to World War I. When women went to work in the factories, they had to modify their dress. Corsets and dresses that covered you from neck to ankle were no longer practical. They could be downright dangerous. So we're going to see that women have changed their dress in that period, and they may no longer work in the factory as they once did during the war, but they don't want to return to those strictures about dress that existed beforehand. Jazz music, as we spoke about in another class, is certainly going to become far more mainstream. We're going to see the technology of the radio in people's homes, and that's going to broadcast their news. It's going to be their entertainment. It's going to create a national culture in ways that hadn't existed previously. The car, although invented in the late 1800s, it is going to be something that the average American can purchase in the 1920s. People like Henry Ford are going to make it accessible and affordable to the masses. The airplane, certainly this was an invention of the early 20th century, but was one that was not certainly mainstream in any way. It's was also being tested in the same way we're talking about going to Mars today, and is it possible to do that? People were wondering in the 1920s, could people fly across oceans? Could you make a journey that would take you clear across the United States without stopping? And by 1926, 1927, those feats are happening. Charles Lindbergh will be the first individual to fly solo and continuously from New York to Paris. He'll get a hero's welcome back when he does this. He designed this plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, for this feat. He is considered really the father of modern aviation in the sense that by achieving this and what he understood in terms of the technological aspects of it, he will help create a consumer airline. He's going to make it possible that for people starting in the 1930s that we can have passenger airlines, which is something that hadn't existed beforehand. We'll come back and we'll look at him in terms of his role, especially in terms of his fame in the 1930s and 40s during the World War II era. But at least in the 1920s, he is seen as the great hero in the United States for what he's able to achieve in terms of air flight. And then we're going to see new forms of business and social organizations. Things like the Better Business Bureau are going to come into being. And it's going to be a way to take these sort of small businesses and give them some greater power, perhaps, than they had once had during the time of laissez-faire. We're also going to see that the government is going to kind of pull away in terms of industrialization when it comes to, enforcing things like the Clayton Antitrust Act. It's almost as though they assume that all the great monopolies have been broken up by this time. But they are going to start subsidizing agriculture. Both approaches, which are going to have a great impact on the economy of the 1930s. We're also going to see that because of the electrification of people's homes, and by the 1920s, much of the labor that people were having to do by hand is going to decrease for working and middle class people. We're also going to see that there is going to be some economic shifts because of this consumer economy. By the mid 1920s, I don't have to shop every single day of the week for fresh food. I have a refrigerator to keep it cool. Laundry day was an entire day before the advent of the washing machine. And this electric washing machine may not look like yours today, but if we took off the cover of the one in your laundry room, its internal structure looks much like that. But literally, I can put on a load of wash and come back. I don't have to actually give hours and hours to this process. It frees up, gives me more leisure time. Things like vacuuming, being able to keep your home clean in that way, not having to cook on an open fire with things like the invention of the toaster. We're also going to see processed food is going to really include everything by the 1920s. You're going to have about 4 generations of Americans who even their vegetables are going to be either frozen or canned. Everything's processed. It's going to have the vitamins added in. But again, I don't necessarily have to spend a great deal of time laboring over making something like soup. I can have it ready and accessible, courtesy of Campbell's. How do I purchase all this great new stuff? Well, buy now, pay later. And that may seem a little strange. Like, how do you buy it now but pay later? Well, what that meant was you walked in, said, I want this car, $50 down, and then you made a payment once a week until the balance plus any interest was paid off. People were doing this with multiple vendors. And so you could have someone who was making 50 cents payment on their new iron and their toaster, maybe $1 a week towards this new washing machine, maybe $2 a week for this refrigerator, maybe $40 a month for this car. All of that functions as long as you have a job. You keep getting paid. If that suddenly ends, which we will see by the 1930s will for about 25% of the population, all of this comes crashing down. And so the consumer economy, the goods are being produced, Americans want to buy them. Why? Well, some of them are truly labor-saving devices. Others, simply by owning them, when we compare ourselves to our neighbor, we may be able to demonstrate greater affluence and success by the stuff we possess. But that consumer economy, very much like the one we have today, emerges in the 1920s. And then we also have this idea of looking backwards. In the 1920s, ideas like Prohibition and nativism, these are not new ideas, these are old ideas. In the 1830s and 1840s, people were talking about temperance. They were talking about let's limit and restrict immigration to the United States by people who aren't seen as possibly ever becoming American because of things like their religion. And then we're also going to see laissez-faire, certainly a return to that. The government that was incredibly progressive and using government as an agency of good, breaking up trust, all of that kind of stops. Unions with the Clayton Antitrust Act are allowed to strike, but in the 1920s, they're often going to find that state and national governments are going to intercede not on their behalf, but also on the behalf of the factory owners themselves. Obviously, this rise in fundamentalism, it existed beforehand. But this religiosity will become a counterpoint to those who are seeking to bring about new ideas. And also, we're going to see a return to Republican presidents. And again, don't construe this that I'm saying voting Republican is backwards. I'm not. What I'm saying is in the late 19th century, certainly from 1860 to 1912, we had one Democratic president, Grover Cleveland. In 1912, America votes for Wilson. They reelect him in 1916. But the outcomes of World War I, the social unrest, the failures of the Treaty of Versailles, create a situation in which people are looking to vote Republicans back into office. And we will have 3 Republican presidents of the 1920s. So let's start with prohibition, right? An old idea that is going to become a constitutional change with the 18th Amendment. It's important to understand the 18th Amendment only prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors. It did not create any penalties. If you go and actually read the text of it, it's just a couple of sentences. One of the reasons why prohibition could become a reality is that the government had another way of not being reliant upon excise taxes on alcohol anymore. The 16th Amendment, which is graduated income tax, was now another source of income, or revenue, I should say, for the national government. And that revenue, well, that could replace potentially what would have been the revenue from excise taxes on alcohol. Also, the government said we're going to fine people. And from that, we'll also be able to make some money as well. What is the actual legislation that regulates prohibition for 13 years is the Volstead Act. That Volstead Act lays out some very specifics in terms of penalties and what's legal and what's not legal. And the interesting thing is Woodrow Wilson, who was a progressive, he vetoed the Volstead Act. He felt that ultimately it wasn't going to be successful. And why wasn't going to be successful? Because constitutionally, you could not make consumption of alcohol illegal. And if you couldn't make that illegal, enforcement was going to be really tough. You're going to see the rise of the speakeasy, so the illegal bar. You had to have a secret knock to often get into these places, or a code word. They sometimes existed in the basements underneath legitimate restaurants of the day. But they were places where one could go in, essentially bars, but it was illegal for you to purchase alcohol in the bar. Often they would have people drinking out of teacups, and people developed a lot of slang in the time, talking about things like hooch. If you ever wondered why adults like mixed drinks, well, that comes out of the culture of the 20s. You have people who are making their own alcohol, some of it not very palatable and some of it quite dangerous, but it goes down a little smoother if you can add tomato juice or orange juice or something else along with it. The sad thing is that in the beginning, it seemed like less people were drinking, but over time, it didn't seem to stop drinking, and perhaps drinking by some individuals actually increased. If you commit the crime once, well, you'll keep doing it. And organized crime will take on a life of its own in the 1920s. It essentially will take what was once a legal business and as an illegal business profit from it. The government's going to have to create all kinds of new agencies. Have you ever heard of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms? They were created in this time period. What was the old Bureau of Investigation will now become the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There'll be a Bureau of Prohibition. The Treasury Department is actually going to have to be able to bring in this revenue. And the IRS is often going to be used. Actually, the IRS and prosecuting people for not paying their taxes will be far more effective in curbing organized crime around alcohol than actually trying to catch these people for the manufacture, sale, and transport of such stuff. So this question of, well, Mrs. Sorbonne, why would it not be possible to make it illegal to consume alcohol? Well, for a couple of different reasons. There are some religions where consumption of alcohol is part of religious practice, and so it would be a First Amendment violation. Also, of the day, many medicines were created using a base that was alcoholic. And so you had doctors who had special prescription pads. You had some people who had a cough for 13 years so they could have an alcohol-based cough syrup. There used to be a product that was marketed called Vicks 44 because at one time its formula included 44% alcohol. So I can't legally go buy vodka, but I can have some cough syrup several times a day if I need it. The looking backwards, the return to an earlier time, we do see it with the Republicans in the White House. And again, looking backwards in the sense of let's return to laissez-faire. The campaign in 1920-21 for this man, Warren G. Harding, and his vice president at the time, Calvin Coolidge, was a return to normalcy. People felt the world was out of control. We'd had this global war. We'd had a global pandemic. We don't join the League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles seems like it's absolutely flawed. And there were people who said, let's go back to before we got into this whole progressive thing, before we got into this idea that we were exceptional and we were going to export our value system abroad. So little government intervention in business. We're going to see that the government, when it wants to create economic change, is going to give farm subsidies. It's going to cut taxes on corporations and individuals. And there's really no pushback from the Democratic Party, which is incredibly fragmented by this time. Southern Democrats are, believing in things like segregation and have no desire to, court African American voters. You also see that in the Democratic Party in urban areas, you might have Catholic or Jewish people who are Democrats, immigrants who generationally had been supported by the political machines of the past, but those people and their candidates can't get elected on a national ballot because the Southern Democratic Party, that wing, doesn't want to vote for those people. So by region, religion, ethnicity, it's a fragmented party, and it really won't be until the crisis of the Great Depression that we'll see a resurgence and a unification of the Democratic Party. So Warren G. Harding talked about normalcy. When he is elected, he is certainly the product of the power structure within the Republican Party of the 1920s. He was a popular, affable man, married to a wealthy woman who had come from a very wealthy publishing family. He had a lot of very questionable friends. As his friends became part of his cabinet, they were called the Ohio Gang, which gives you a sense that there wasn't a lot of respect for their ideas or their integrity. He was often called a friend to everyone. He seemed to like lots of people, but because he had lots of friends, sometimes he was not very judicious in who those people were. And personally had some failings. He had relationships with women outside of marriage, including having a child. He was someone who seemed far more interested in making sure his friends could continue to financially benefit from the roles they were taking on in his White House. And it'll come to a head with something called the Teapot Dome scandal. So Teapot Dome was a region in Wyoming that people could actually lease, and there were oil companies that leased it in order to have access to the crude that lied beneath the soil. And the Secretary of the Interior, who was one of many people of this Ohio gang, made it known that Congress typically would approve any person's lease of federal land as long as the Secretary of the Interior gave the go-ahead, said, yeah, sure, absolutely, this is legitimate. So for a small fee, it turned out that Albert Fall, for $40,000 cash, would sign off that your business should be given the lease. And it was caught first with this area known as Teapot Dome. By looking into that, we're going to see lots of other people resign, including the Attorney General, who also knew this was going on. Before there was Watergate and Richard Nixon, this was the biggest scandal to come along. It was even bigger than what Grant did, because unfortunately for Grant, he had some bad choices, but once those people left, it seemed like things got better, and nobody could ever tie the actual stealing of monies directly to him or his knowing about it. Warren G. Harding actually dies in office. And he didn't even die in office. He died in a hotel room in San Francisco, probably with a young woman. And so ultimately, what happens is that the Republican Party says, we like who the vice president is. He's going to become president. We're just going to clear out everybody who'd been part of this cabinet who's remaining, and we'll move on. If Warren G. Harding had a good quality, it is one that he did advocate for racial equality. One of the things that Wilson did in the name of progressivism is actually segregate federal office buildings, and also put a curtailment on the hiring of African Americans for federal jobs. And Warren G. Harding will attempt to undo some of that during his time in office. You can see by 1924, the Vice President Calvin Coolidge, who's now running for president in his own right, he's going to do very well through most of the country. And again, you can see some very significant decisions being made regionally. If we take Wisconsin out, which is essentially the home of Robert La Follette and what is all of that recall initiative, right? All those great progressive ideals, and who was running as a third-party candidate. Outside of that, it's only in the South where you're seeing the Democratic candidate get elected. Everybody else is voting Republican in some pretty big numbers. So we are going to see that one of the things that happens in this time period is that farmers are going to struggle. They overproduced in the 19 teens. You can see, right, we have this huge growth in terms of production. And part of that comes from the fact that Europe is hungry. There's a war going on. But when that war ends and European farmers come back online, well, there isn't the market. And you can see a huge drop in terms of what people can sell. And those losses begin to add up. The government doesn't mandate a reduction in production. They simply start paying out subsidies to farmers. And that's going to be a big, big problem to come in the 1930s. And that's going to be something that Warren Harding will advocate for, certainly Calvin Coolidge, and most definitely Herbert Hoover, who will be the last president of the 20s. Calvin Coolidge is essentially the opposite. And you often find this if you think about recent elections, sometimes who the vice president is, they are, in terms of personality and demeanor, often an opposite, quite a polar opposite to the president. And Calvin Coolidge was an incredibly conservative man. He had been someone who had come from the Northeast and was seen as pretty taciturn. You can see him even on vacation. He was in a suit. He was somebody also who thought that Wilson had gone too far in terms of the United States being involved in World War I. He wasn't necessarily anti-war, but he felt especially things like the Treaty of Versailles were misguided. He will encourage the country as much as possible to be isolationist. And his Commerce Secretary, who in 1928 will become the next president, Herbert Hoover, he will also advocate for these ideas. The United States will actually sign something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, in which we sign with countries like Japan and Germany that war will never be used to settle disputes between countries. So obviously, it was not a long-lasting or legitimate claim. But there was this feeling that there should be isolationism, that the government, as much as possible, should step out of the economy, that the economy essentially could regulate itself, that we'd broken up the big, most egregious of the monopolies, the trusts like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel, and everything else would take care of itself. The Secretary of the Treasury through much of the 20s was a man named Andrew Mellon. And if that name sounds familiar, he was essentially the Pennsylvania advocate for many of the banking practices that J.P. Morgan also used. So the Mellon family and the Morgan family were the great banking families of the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And Andrew Mellon said that the country could pay off its debt. They'd collected enough taxes, and because they had, we needed to reduce taxes. We wanted people to not pay the government, but essentially buy. They were going to get their money directly into the economy that way. And so we're seeing that the country itself in the 1920s feels very confident economically. But as again we see, there are some underlying problems, and overproduction by farmers that then is masked by subsidies is one of those. And even the cartoonists of the time, there were people who said, okay, the farmer needs first aid, he needs help. And even when Congress does give that help, it's not enough. We're still in a deflationary cycle in this time period. And so we're seeing overproduction for farmers is just not good. When we speak about the tensions between science and fundamentalism, I want to clarify what we mean by fundamentalism. So there are lots of religious faiths that have fundamentalist factions. When we speak about fundamentalism, we usually are speaking about a religious group that looks to a holy text and takes its meaning literally. And so you can see that well beyond Christianity, but we're going to speak about Christianity today because those are the fundamentalists we're interested in. There is a third Great Awakening between 1890 and 1920, again, across Protestant sects, but the ones that are gaining the biggest membership are ones that are wanting to return to the fundamentals of Christianity. Particularly the Baptist Church will continue to grow in this time. And also people who are fundamentalist preachers who may be outside of the bounds of what are the traditional sects of Christianity in the United States. A literal translation of the Bible means that the earth is 5,000 years old, that God created it in 6 days and then rested, that there is a holy trinity of God, of Jesus Christ, and what is called the Holy Spirit, and that these are three distinct things, and they're all real, and that essentially the way we look at our lives and how we interact with each other need to be based in these fundamental truths. We're going to see the beginnings of what will become, certainly by the mid to late 20th century, as televangelism, but we're going to see a lot of popular evangelical preachers who are going to utilize things like the radio, one of the most famous being a man named Billy Sunday, who wanted to engage audiences much like the preachers of the Second Great Awakening, that you emotionally needed to feel something. But if there is underpinnings of the movement, we saw with the First Great Awakening, it was the personal experience with God. The Second Great Awakening, it's going to be religion is doing, so the reform. And with the Third Great Awakening, it's going to be about making sure that religious life and religious thought doesn't give way to the secular world, doesn't give up its power and influence. So this all comes to a head in 1924 in Dayton, Tennessee, when a man named John Scopes, who had been hired as a substitute teacher, teaches evolution in biology class. Now, Tennessee, the year before, had passed something called the Butler Act, saying that teachers couldn't teach about evolution. John Scopes was a member of the ACLU. He deliberately takes on this role to be a gadfly in order to bring about what he hopes is essentially a referendum on this idea. Can evolution be taught as part of biology in schools? He's arrested and he is put on trial. And you have two sides that very quickly form. The ACLU, one of their most famous members was an attorney named Clarence Darrow, who had represented lots of different people, including Eugene Debs. He comes out to Tennessee to represent John Scopes. The state of Tennessee wants to prosecute it themselves, but they also want someone high profile on their side. And they find that in William Jennings Bryan. If that name sounds familiar, he is our Democrat who gives his goodwill and good name to the populist movement in order to bring about really a conversation about the legitimacy of the Populist Party's platform in the 1890s. William Jennings Bryan at this point is no longer a member of Congress. He was a fundamentalist Christian. We can see with that cross of gold speech, right? Very evocative of his religious beliefs. But William Jennings Bryan's coming to assist. This entire trial is broadcast by radio. And every day, people are entertained by interviews outside of the courtroom with people like Darrow and Bryan. And ultimately, people who are listening to the case, those who live in cities, especially people who live up north and in the West, it seems like these people in Dayton, Tennessee are a little bit backwards. Like, really? Like, we're actually going to, pick apart what is evolutionary teaching. It seemed like at this point it was almost sort of the standard, certainly in colleges of the time. Clarence Darrow is going to be the face of modernity and a secular science approach to education. And William Jennings Bryan is going to be representative of people who believe that the secular world perhaps has gone too far, is too invasive, and we need to reassert these religious fundamentalist values. The nation hears it, and certainly for people who don't live in the rural South, they are convinced that Clarence Darrow has done a good job, that he actually has shown that there is no legitimacy, at least to teach what is biblical answers to biology. How does he do this? Well, William Jennings Bryan, as an assistant and as someone who's giving interviews every day, he gets called as a witness. And Clarence Darrow calls him to be a witness simply to speak about his understanding and teachings of the Bible. And on the stand, he is able to question Bryan in such a way that Bryan has to answer truthfully. Do you believe in dinosaurs? Yes, I do. Dinosaurs are older than 5,000 years. Yes. Well, then, are there dinosaurs in the Bible? No. Well, wait a minute. How do you know that one existed, but you still believe in this biblical teaching that the earth is not that old? They speak about the stories of the Old Testament of who are the first two people, Adam and Eve. And then, do you believe Eve was actually made from the rib of Adam? Are these two people ultimately the parents of all the other human beings that have ever existed on earth? And question by question, Bryan is having to answer that that's not literal. And in doing so, he basically wins the case for Darrow. However, the jury is full of people from rural Tennessee, and they vote in favor of prosecuting John Scopes, and he is found guilty. But certainly for audiences outside of the South, outside of rural America, they question really what are small town values, and really begin to embrace the sort of intellectual superiority of urban people over those who are from rural and small town areas. Certainly, we see a lot of technology and economic growth, and I've spoken a little bit about that in terms of cars and radios, what will eventually be the airplane. But it's important to understand that with something like the car, you're going to create all kinds of other tangentially related businesses. So in terms of, tire production, all of the inner parts that are required to make a combustion engine work, the fact that gasoline, right, is going to be used as the product, the energy source, that all of those things are going to continue to add to economic growth. We're also going to see the beginnings of synthetics. So nylon cloth, bakelite, which functions almost like a plastic today and was often used for the coverings of kitchen appliances. Asbestos, which was a fire retardant product, which we don't use anymore because it can cause health problems, but was used to create all kinds of siding for houses, flooring, especially in places like schools and hospitals. You're going to also see that certain companies are going to be allowed to consolidate, meaning they're allowed to buy other companies. General Motors originally was Chevrolet, it was Cadillac. These were all separate companies, Pontiac. General Motors will be allowed to be as a company to buy up these smaller producers to create this larger one. In some ways, an antithesis to what we saw in the progressive era. But again, farm prices are going to continue to drop. We're going to have a lot of overproduction. And we're going to see that big business is going to have a lot more power than they did during the progressive time, and especially will be able to be on the side of victory when it comes against striking unions. The AFL is also going to continue to not let African Americans and women and most immigrants be part of their organization. So for the skilled members of the AFL, they'll keep their jobs. They may not see pay increases in the 20s, but in part because they continue to be a smaller organization. At times they lose that power struggle with big business. But it's not to say that big business totally forgets its people. There's going to be certain companies that are going to do what they call welfare capitalism, meaning that they're capitalistic enterprises, but one of their priorities is the welfare of their employees. So companies like Ford Motor Company, actually General Motors will do the same thing as well. They'll pay pensions. You work for them for 25 years, you'll get a little check every month when you retire. The workday is now typically 10 hours or less. We won't quite have that 8-hour workday till the 1930s, but even paid vacations. I could work on the line at Ford, and at least 1 week a year, I got still my check, but I could go away to vacation. Lots of companies created campgrounds and parks and vacation centers for their employees, or they might just locally build a swimming pool. So in the summer months, their employees, children, and families can enjoy some leisure time. But we're going to see that big business, for the most part, is not going to have any significant strictures against it as it did in an earlier period. We're also going to see some demographic changes. So we are going to see that, yes, the middle class, the number of people who are middle class will increase in size. However, we still have people who are living at that subsistence level or in poverty, and that's still about a third of the country at that time. So in a sense, the working class sees no increases in their wages. It's kind of the same dynamic we're seeing in an earlier time period. But do we have the uber rich that we did prior to the 16th Amendment? Not quite so many as we once did. And we've spoken about pink collar jobs for women that emerge out of the late 19th century. They will continue to grow through this time period, primarily secretarial and retail work for women. But there are going to be professions. Nursing is truly going to become a profession as a result of World War I. Women as teachers, at least until marriage, will become a norm, and college education for women will be directed for those purposes. Also social work, as seen as a woman's profession, will emerge in this time. But we're also going to see for African Americans who are traveling north with the Great Migration, those who found jobs in World War I, in many cases didn't get to keep them. And so what kind of work are they finding in the 1920s? In the North and the West, often things like garbage collection, domestic service. You can see with our diagram here, African Americans working on farms is ever continuing to decrease. However, the kind of work that they're taking on is typically not professional work. And as laborers, it's often that which is service work. We're also going to see some changes with modern life. And the two that I want to talk about, the first one is this idea of religion. So there is this fundamentalist movement, but there are religious people who believe that fundamentalism is archaic, that there are not literal truths in the Bible. Essentially, the Bible is a book of guidelines. They're good stories, and they are important stories, but science is real, and God and science can coexist. And probably the person to best articulate that was a man named Reverend Emerson Fosdick. And he ran the Riverside Church in New York City, which had one of the largest congregations in the country. And he also had a radio show, so he was able, and wrote books, so he was able to disseminate his ideas. But he argued that you could be a religious person, believe in God, believe in the life and the miracle of Jesus Christ, but still believe that evolution is a real thing, and believe that spirituality was important, but it could not sacrifice the realities that science had demonstrated for us. We're also going to see that Sunday is no longer going to be, for most people, a true Sabbath day. In the United States, until the 1920s, most businesses would not be open on a Sunday. Um, Sunday was for the purposes of church going and maybe spending time with family and friends in terms of eating a common meal together. Stores weren't open. Starting in the 20s, you're going to see stores being open on Sunday, people perhaps going out to eat on a Sunday. The expectation is you might go to church for an hour in the morning, but that you would maybe go to an athletic contest like a baseball game or something in the afternoon. So entertainment, commerce on a Sunday would be acceptable. We're also going to see that marriage fundamentally is going to take on its modern existence. Prior to the 1920s, you still saw a certain amount of parenting, especially when it came to middle and upper class families, trying to create the marriage circumstances for their children, bringing together two families. What becomes the norm is what's known as the companionate marriage, and that is the marriage between two people who love each other, and that's the goal. Until you find romantic love, you shouldn't find marriage. We're also going to see families where husband and wife get married and delay having children, and so using birth control in order to have time together and then take on family life, and then at some point adopt birth control again. Once you have the number of children that you desire, that's going to become the norm. And obviously, as I spoke about before, the rise of youth culture. Adolescence is not the short period of physical change anymore, but it continues well past those physical changes. People are taking on education, schooling, preparing for adulthood, even though they're physically adults, well into their late teens and 20s. So as we close out today, I just want you to think about a couple of things. And the big one is the 1920s a new era or a return to normalcy? Both those things can exist. I've got some different quotations here for you to take a look at. But with these, I just want you to consider that we can have a time period in which we see all kinds of advancements in certain aspects like technology and socially, but then we could also see a retraction or a desire to go back to earlier ideas. And that can impact our politics and our social life as well.